Here's a factoid about me. It's only been in the last, 2 to 3 months that I've ever used an ad blocker. This is really just a personal preference thing. I'm not annoyed by the presence of ads, and I know the struggles of publishers to pay their hosting bills. So for the longest time, I didn't care. And surprisingly, it wasn't all the research and interviews I did for this ad tech season that changed my mind and got me using the ad blocker. It was something much more subtle. To be frank, it was YouTube. They added this especially obnoxious banner that would repeatedly reappear even if after you closed it, and I just found the whole thing a bit offended. Sorry if there's a product manager listening, but those are my thoughts. I didn't write down the day, but there it was. I installed my ad blocker, and now it's there. And you know that tendency to assume the rest of the world thinks like you? That's a dangerous thing. Only like my hacker friends and real libertarian indie type people seem to use ad blockers, or at least talk about them, so I thought, it's a little rare. But boy, was I wrong. Here's a totally biased poll I ran on Twitter. I asked, how often do you use an ad blocker? I offered sometimes, always, and never. And I got 81% always use an ad blocker. So that's self-reported, it's selection bias. It's only those of you who follow the podcast at Data Skeptic on Twitter. But I was surprised how high that is. So I would certainly be remiss to not talk a little bit about ad blockers on our ad tech season. So today I'm interviewing Shunyao Yan about the paper, How Does the Adoption of Ad Blockers Affect News Consumption? Yan and colleagues got access to a really interesting data set that allowed them to ask some novel questions about the usage here. All that and more coming up.
Hi everyone, my name is Shunyao Yan. I'm currently an assistant professor in marketing at Clara University. I just graduated as a PhD student from Goethe University, Frankfurt in Germany. So I just started my new position as an assistant professor here in the sunny California.
And marketing covers a broad range of disciplines. Could you talk a little bit more about your academic background?
Sure. So my current research kind of lies in the intersection between advertising and media. In particular, I look at how digital advertising impacts how users consuming news online, and also how it impacts how publishers producing news online. For instance, in the ad blocker paper that we're going to discuss today, I look at how users, after they adopt an ad blocker, so they see much less ads after adopting an ad blocker. Do they read more news? Do they read broader news? And then I also look at how publishers, after they relying less on ad revenue, but more on subscription revenue, does the news that they produce become more differentiated or more informative? And then trying to better measure how informative a news or a textual data is, I also work on some NLP tool that helps us to better capture how informative a textual data is. So that's pretty much how my current research is about.
Well, news is not a new concept. It's somewhat new online, but we've had TV and radio and newspapers and that sort of thing beforehand. I imagine there's been some interest and scholarship around it. Does any of the legacy knowledge transfer, or is digital a whole new domain?
It's not only that news is not new, it's actually ad blocking or ad avoiding is also not something new. Scholars, we study both advertising and also ad avoiding, and also media consumption or news consumption from several decades ago. In the old yellow book age and also the paper magazine age, there are actually a lot of papers finding that yellow books, yellow pages, or magazines featuring more advertising, especially informative advertising, they actually sell much better. And it's because advertising, just like news, they provide information to consumers. So consumers also like the media, for instance, the yellow page or the magazine better if they have more information or informative ads there. So in that age or in those two kinds of media, advertising actually kind of increase the media consumption. But then after we move online, after we start to see more and more ads every day, things change a little bit. After display ads are being popular online, there is a phenomenon called banner blindness, which says that since we see too many ads online every day, we are getting used to ads. So actually seeing or not seeing ads doesn't really make a difference in terms of our media consumption because we banner blind. We are used to ignoring it. Recently, especially with this ad blocking becoming more and more popular, there's also some lab studies saying that after we do not see ads, we actually could increase our media consumption because ads are so annoying and it occupies a lot of our cognitive resources. But before our study, there has only been lab experiments going on, so no really real world behavior data backing up this finding. And that's what our paper kicks in, trying to use how ad blocker adopters really change their real world news consumption behavior online after adopting an ad blocker.
Is there anything you've learned about people who decide to use an ad blocker? Are these all real, technically savvy people, or is it really a random sample of the population?
There are a lot of survey studies out there asking why people adopt an ad blocker. And the leading or the top three reasons are people get annoyed by ads online, and also that people, they are privacy concerned. So they want to have an ad blocker trying to protect themselves from being tracked. It could also be that users who just randomly get to know that an ad blocker exists. That's why they adopt an ad blocker. So I think it's fair to say that it's the more tech-savvy person trying to adopt an ad blocker online. But it could also happen that users just randomly get to know that an ad blocker exists. And actually, in our data, that's back to 2015, there's an event actually increases consumer awareness of ad blocker. That's in September 2015, Apple allowed the ad blocking feature in its mobile in Safari for the first time, which creates a lot of consumer awareness of ad blocker. We see that from the Google trend that the search of ad blocker actually peaks in 2015 September. So that's one event that vastly increased consumer awareness of ad blocker.
So, as you get to look through historical data that has the pre and post period, how impactful was that event?
So that event actually increases the adoption of ad blocker by over 10% in our data.
Hmm.
So that's a quite impactful event, actually.
And then could we dig into the underlying raw data set that you're working with? Where does it come from and what does it contain?
I had this luxury to have this data from a leading European news publisher who prefers to stay anonymous. Essentially, we have their clickstream data, which documents each registered user's the page they clicked from an URL, and then also the timestamp of the users who clicks the page on the news website.
Mm-hmm.
And also, what's really exciting and allows us to do the whole analysis is this publisher also tracks the ad blocker usage of the data. So, which is essentially a variable stating how many ad blocking page impressions exist. And if there is a positive number of that ad block page impressions, then it indicates a user used an ad blocker. If it's zero, then it indicates the user does not use an ad blocker. And we get to see that before and after a user adopts an ad blocker because we can observe users changing from having zero ad blocking page impressions to positive number of ad blocking page impressions. We can see how their news consumption increase, decrease over time.
Earlier, we touched on that statistic that you saw a 10% increase. Could you ground us in the relative numbers? What's out of all the visitors coming, what percentage of them are using ad blockers?
Across the year, it's 2015. There are around 24% of all the users coming into our websites using an ad blocker, which actually is in line with aggregate statistics out there, kind of show how different European countries are using ad blocking. Back at that time in Europe, the statistics range from 20% to 38%. And the users who come into our websites adopting an ad blocker is 24%. So that's very in line with the aggregate statistics. And then in particular, we are interested in the users who really adopt an ad blocker during our observation period, in the sense that we are interested in the users who do not use ad blocking for a while, but start to use an ad blocker because of this event. So they have this change in their ad blocking behavior. And they are around 10% out of the whole users coming to our websites.
That's very interesting. I mean, you see them in a before and after period, but I'm wondering about when your sessions start. Like if I get a brand new computer, maybe a cookie does or doesn't carry over. I don't know when I started going to new sites. It's always just been something I've done. When you look at this longitudinally, what kind of sampling frequency, or do you have any issues dealing with those types of concerns?
Sure. So what's also nice is that we get to see people's different browsers as well. For instance, if you get a new laptop or we also get to see their device. So if you get a new laptop or just start using a new browser, we can see that as well. And we in particularly look at the users who we observe for a while, not having ad blocker, but start to have one within our observation period. So as long as the users they're registered and they visit our websites, then no matter from which device or which browser you're visiting, we can capture all of that.
Well, my instinct tells me that the adoption of a ad blocking technology is probably independent of visiting your site. I guess the alternative theory is that the site is so riddled with ads that people choose to adopt it as a result of the visit. I guess I'm curious, how do you look at it?
We are very interested in how really the ad blocker adoption impacts the news consumption. And there are two major weaknesses that potentially would impact our analysis if we do not do it correctly. The first one is what you just outlined. If the users adopt an ad blocker simply because the ads in our website is too much, then they adopt an ad blocker because they want to read more news. So that's not something that we want. And the second is that the ad blocker adoption decision and also the news consumption can be correlated in many ways. For instance, a more educated person might be more likely to adopt an ad blocker, but also might be more likely to read news. So we don't want either of these two things happening in our analysis. So what we did is for this correlation thing, more educated person, more likely to adopt ad blocker and also read news, we try to control everything that we can observe and cannot observe in a lot of ways. For instance, we can observe users' age, users' salary level in our user CRM data because they are all registered users. So a lot of them provide all these statistics about themselves that we can control them either in the terms of a regression, like controlling them linearly in a linear regression, but we also control them using a matching method, which is non-parametric in the sense that we are comparing the news consumption difference between users who are very similar in all the characteristics that we can observe. And then for the things that you're particularly worried about, do users adopt an ad blocker simply because they want to read more news or because they are really annoyed by the ads, so many ads in our websites? We use something called Hackman selection model, which we can first modeling users' ad blocker behavior in the first stage. And then in the second stage, we modeling their news consumption behavior. And then the beauty of Hackman selection model is that it can take the error term of the first stage, meaning that any reason we don't know about why users adopt an ad blocker, it enters into the second stage of news consumption. So we can really test if it is really because users, they want to read more news that makes them adopt an ad blocker. And we find that it is not the case. So it is really that users kind of adopt an ad blocker randomly because of the events that I mentioned in the beginning that drives their adoption of ad blocker and then drives their news consumption.
And when you're describing that you're able to verify that, is that through analysis or through experimentation? Thanks to our sponsor, ClearML. ClearML is an open source MLOps solution users love to customize. It helps you easily track, orchestrate, and automate ML workflows at scale. Machine learning is no fad. Your organization is only going deeper on investment. Don't let this be a source of technical debt. ClearML can improve every step in your ML workflow, making it a tool loved by data engineers, ML engineers, DevOps people, and data scientists alike. ClearML is hands down the best collaborative ML tool with full visibility and extensibility. As a contributor on a machine learning team, ClearML amplifies your efforts. As a manager, ClearML gives you the transparency and metrics to guide your team's efforts effectively when you can't get pulled into the weeds. Their solution logs your entire process. Your data and models are versioned, so there's no questions of provenance or audits that can't be done. Model repositories give you a clear view of available binaries, and you can deploy pipelines directly from code. Supercharge your entire development process. Go check out ClearML today. Visit clear.ml to get started. And when you're describing that you're able to verify that, is that through analysis or through experimentation?
It's through analysis. We didn't really do experiment, but the whole analysis I was just describing is trying to mimic an experiment as much as possible. For instance, in an experiment, you would want to randomize users, making sure that the probability that users in your treatment and control groups have the same probability, 50%. There, we try to mimic it by trying to match users based on all their characteristics, and then trying to mimic the situation that the probability of adopters and non-adopters adopting an ad blocker is similar to 50%. So we are trying to mimic an experiment, but we didn't really run an experiment.
Well, I think that's positive news still for the new site. It implies that at least they're not making a mistake, right? They're not driving people towards this based on your analysis. Maybe some other site does, but not this one.
Yes.
But I was also surprised, even though I guess it's sort of a known standard, I learned from your paper about how, in my opinion, a high rate of people are showing up with this. Basically, 1 in 4 people have an ad blocker, higher than I thought, which gives me a little pause and makes me wonder about this complaint the publishers have. Is that fair, or are these people stealing, I guess? Do you have any thoughts on the matter?
This is actually quite interesting because back in 2015, it was around 1 in 4. But up to now, I think the most recent statistics from last year is that already 50% of users in the age group in the age group from 16 to I guess 50 or 60, 1 in 2 they actually use at least some sort of ad blocking. So the publishers, especially the publishers in Germany, because one of the most famous ad blocker software, AdBlocker Plus, the parent company is based in Germany. So the publishers in Germany was quite unhappy about AdBlocker and thinks that users are just stealing or just free riding by using ad blocking. So they actually tried to sue the AdBlocker's parent company IO for many times. All these lawsuits were kind of dismissed by the German Supreme Courts because the policymakers think that consumers should decide whether they want to see ads or not. And that's actually also what I think as a user. So when publishers trying to feed ads to us on internet, they also didn't ask for our consent. So I think consumers should really and can really decide whether they want to see ads or not. Also, since publishers are trying to earn subscription revenue as well, so they want to have rather loyal users and also trying to have paying users. The results of our study shows that after users adopt an ad blocker and not seeing ads, they actually get to learn the content of the news publisher better. So they tend to come back to the news websites more often. And also in the end, we have some aggregator showing that the ad blocker users' subscription probability is higher than those who do not subscribe. So ad blocker users can contribute in the other way by subscribing. So I think publishers, since ad blocker is here to stay because policymakers think they're legitimate, publishers should think about other ways to monetize this ad blocker users.
And do you have any idea, this may be outside the realm of scope of your expertise, but Has the industry kind of gotten that message? These results that you're sharing are kind of surprising that, the people who are using the ad blockers, I could label them as my enemy because I think I'm losing revenue, or I could look into some of these stats and say, hey, they're more likely to subscribe and some of these other features. Is that wisdom being digested?
I think so. So we actually tried to present this paper to a lot of publishers as well, after we are rather confident with our results and before it gets published. And we do observe that some publishers, after our presentation, they try to kind of come up with this ad-free subscription options. So meaning that they kind of get the result of our paper and trying to monetize users who potentially don't want to see ads in another way. But we also observe that some websites are still trying to blocking ad blocker users. So it's kind of becoming an arms race in a sense. I guess the message of our paper is that potentially, if you don't block ad blocker users, there might be benefits there as well. So I think there are both sides. Some publishers are digesting and trying to making other ways to monetize these users, but some are not.
Obviously, the data says what it says, but maybe we shouldn't read too far into it. But I'm curious if you have any kind of intuition as to some of these findings. Like it's a little surprising to me that, or maybe not surprising, but it's novel that the people who had ad blocker are consuming more of your content. What might be the reason for something like that?
We have three hypotheses in mind. The first potential reason that we thought about is potentially if users are using different browsers to read news, then it could be that they are just increasing their news consumption on the browser or on the technology that enable them to not seeing ads. But then it could be that this increase in news consumption is just a substitution of their decreasing their news consumption in the browser that without ad blocker. So the first hypothesis that it's not really a real increase in news consumption, it's just users are substituting their news consumption across different technologies. We find evidence inconsistent with this reason, even on the browsers that could not install an ad blocker back at that time, back in 2015. Users do not decrease their news consumption on browsers without an ad blocker. So assuming there's a person using two browsers to read news on our website, one with ad blocker, one without ad blocker, even though they increase their news consumption in browsers with ad blocker, they do not decrease their news consumption without ad blocker. And in the long term, so in 4 weeks or so after they adopt an ad blocker, they actually also increase their news consumption in the browser without an ad blocker. So the potential reason is not that users are just substituting. And then the second reason we had in mind is potentially they have limited cognitive resources. So if they're both ads and news on the same page, then they're just left with less cognitive resources to read news. Then we tested by also looking at users' visit frequencies, because what is really cognitive restricted is our working memory that functions in the short term. So if it's really the cognitive resources driving the increase in news consumption, then we should expect the increase in news consumption happen within visit session. So what we are trying to say is that it's unlikely that a user can save his cognitive resources from not seeing ads in this session to the next session, for instance, 1 day later, until the next time he visits our news website. And we also find cognitive resources, even though it's in play. For instance, users, they also increase their time spent within visit session. And they also tend to read longer news articles within visit session. However, they actually do not increase one more page views, one more news articles within visit session. Instead, it's really that users coming back to our websites more frequently, especially direct visiting our website through typing a URL, for instance, that driving the news consumption that we identified. And there are potentially some positive state dependency reasons behind. For instance, users could just learn from their experience without ads that their preference match better with our news website over time. Could also be that users, they kind of form a habit of coming to our websites after not seeing ads. But it's really this kind of learning and also keep coming back to our website that is also an indication of increased user loyalty that driving the increase in news consumption.
These, I guess we could label them behavioral differences, are some of the most interesting ones between the group of people with and without an ad blocker.
Right.
Are there any like demographic features or other components here that have an interesting distinction when you compare the two groups?
Sure. So we find that actually it's the users who, well, so it's male, which is probably not that surprising. It's male that is more likely to adopt an ad blocker, and also relatively low income users more likely to adopt an ad blocker. Or in other sense, it's the female and also the high income users who are least likely to adopt an ad blocker. And this characteristics is potentially also interested for advertisers as well, because advertisers also was not happy with ad blockers as well. I think it's the IAB in Europe kind of publicly claiming ad blockers as theft. But it turns out that from our analysis, this female and also high income ones who are more likely to respond to advertising and more likely to make a purchase. These users are least likely to adopt an ad blocker. So meaning that ad blocker could actually serve as a filter for advertisers that users who potentially won't click ads anyways, they use an ad blocker, but those who do not use an ad blocker, they are just more likely to respond to ads from the first place.
Well, if I were the owner of the news site, I would take that argument and say this is a filtering technique. The non-ad clickers, you're not even going to pay for their impressions anymore. They're self-filtering.
Exactly. So that's even a good news for advertisers.
And earlier you described the raw data that I believe was a timestamp and then the URL they requested, and of course some of that extra metadata we've mentioned along the way. That's a great data set, but it's also a very raw data set, not one you can quickly write a SQL query against to get an insight. Could you talk a little bit about some of the steps to do feature engineering or data transformation to make that more useful?
It's actually rather structured, I would argue, because the timestamp, for instance, by itself, it's just a column of variable, and then for the news consumption, then it's nothing but page impressions, and page impressions kind of divided by whether it's a landing page or whether it's political news, it's sports news, so on and so forth. So all these are actually quite structured in a sense. And then for the ad blocker usage, it's also just a column indicating how many ads are being blocked, if at all. So what I did is nothing but just doing some aggregation. For instance, I aggregate the raw data, which comes in the second level, to a week level. And then I would just aggregate all the news consumption in terms of the page impressions by week and also by different kind of news categories. And then for the ad blocker usage, I simply create another variable indicating whether this user experienced a change from experiencing zero ad blocker usage for 2 weeks, 3 weeks, or 4 weeks to a positive number of ad blocker usage after 2, 3, or 4 weeks. So it's rather structured data we have compared to a lot of really unstructured data like textual data or image data, for instance.
Well, you'd mentioned then aggregating it by week, and this was a study that went on for many weeks. Could you talk a little bit about what the longitudinal trends were, or why that, period of time was interesting versus just a snapshot?
First, we think it's interesting because our observation period has in total around 20 weeks. And it's interesting first because of the event that I mentioned. That is the event that creates the maximum consumer awareness of ad blocker in the history, at least seeing from the Google Trends. And then it's also interesting because this is the period that we can see not only in a very short term, do users increase their news consumptions by days, first day, second day, or the fifth day after they adopt an ad blocker. But we can also see it after several weeks. And that's rather long compared to a lot of lab experiment, which could potentially only last for 1 day, 2 days or so. So that's the longitude of the data. And then we observe that users not only increase their news consumption within the first week, that's around 40% increase in the quantity, the number of news articles users read, but also the variety. They increase the different news categories that they read by 30% within 1 week. But they also increase it over 4 weeks. The magnitude decreased a little bit, so it's around 20% after 4 weeks and also 30% after 4 weeks. But it's still a rather large lift considering it's 4 weeks after adopting an ad blocker.
I know you have only access to the range that the news site shared with you, but I'm curious if they had shared everything up until the present. Do you think there were any other events as monumentous as this allowance Apple made to allow ad blocking?
Well, I think recently, especially after the GDPR happening in Europe, there are just more and more browsers and also this privacy protecting kind of blockers online. So I think recently there will also be a lot of interesting events happening, which I unfortunately don't have the data for this news publishers, but my co-authors and I have some interesting data as well, capturing this recently more privacy protected kind of events. But I would actually say that this first event that Apple created actually generates the most interesting and the most exogenous kind of variation in users adopting of ad blocker. So the events happening more after, potentially more self-selection might be going on. So I think this first event happening is most interesting in my sense.
So, if I were a publisher reading your research and I still was somehow vehemently against ad blockers, I guess I could work on that cat and mouse game you described of blocking the blockers. Or maybe I could take it the other way and say, the people who block, they have these nice behaviors in terms of the quality of their visits and the quantity. Can I somehow get my product team to, I don't know, optimize the ads or trim down the ads or do something that doesn't hurt revenue but promotes the same behaviors in non blocking users? Is that a realistic place to invest effort?
So currently, what we see in the online advertising industry is that we are rather good at customizing advertising or ad delivery based on, for instance, I'm interested in fashion maybe, but you are interested in sports. We are good at customizing that kind of user interest. However, the current online ad delivery doesn't really do any customization about the user's ad potential ad aversion and also ad sensitivity at all. For instance, I think what a news publisher can do is that they could try to just estimate how ad averse a user potentially is based on, for instance, does the user ever click an ad on our websites before? And also, does this user adopt an ad blocker at all before? And then potentially the publishers could serve less ads to those users. They predicted more ad averse, but serving a bit more to the users have more ad tolerance. I think it might be a very interesting avenue in the future.
What do you think the news sites will look like in 5 years?
In 5 years, I really would hope that they could leverage this users' different ad sensitivity, ad aversion in a better way. In the sense, if I'm more ad averse, then potentially I don't need to see that much ads by default, but potentially another person who is more tolerant to ads, he can see a bit more. So I really want to see the publishers and also the whole advertising industry online leveraging this user ad aversion in a better way. Yeah, that's what I hope to see. And potentially, I think it might be the future.
Yeah, I think that's a good vision. You had mentioned some NLP tools you work on. Could you share a few
Yeah.
details about those?
The NLP tool that I described a little bit in the beginning is a method called information seeking argument mining. So this is textual analysis tool that would extract the reasoning behind an emotion from textual data. For instance, currently there are a lot of textual analysis method that's extracting the emotion part of a text. For instance, I'm very happy today, that it's a positive emotion, but not a lot of tools, if at all, if any, they analyze whether there's a reason behind the emotion. For instance, I'm really happy today because I came on the show. Then I came on the show. It's a reason behind the happy emotion. So that is how the information seeking argument mining will extract it's a reason behind a certain emotion. And I think that's a very interesting tool because a lot of companies, they have this dashboard that would monitor the user's emotions from social media, for instance, and online reviews about the product of the company or about the service of the company. So it just came as a sentiment kind of line in the dashboard of the company. But usually what company is really interested in is the reason behind why my consumer is happy or not happy about my service. But this information seeking argument mining can automatically extract this reasoning for the company, which can help them to improve their service and products. And then for me analyzing news articles, I think it's also super interesting because this might serve as a rather good measure of the quality or how informative a news article is. So currently in the literature, a lot of measure of the quality of a news article is simply by how long the article is. If an article contains more words, potentially it's a more high quality news article. But this reasoning part can allow us to add another dimension of the quality of a news article or any textual data. So that's this NLP tool.
Very neat. And do you have a vision for the direction on this? Is it just a tool that you can use in your other research, or could this be an open source library or a product or something like that?
Yes, so my co-authors are Greek computer scientists from the Technical University of Darmstadt in Germany. They actually have a company leveraging this information seeking argument mining NLP method that I just described. Then they can use it, for instance, consumer feedbacks or consumer complaints online, helping companies to understand things better. They also have a online website that I think potentially I can send you so you can link it to the show notes, that any researchers who is interested in this method can definitely request a diamond and try to use it in their own research.
Is there anywhere listeners can follow you online?
Yeah, so I have a Twitter, which I'm not active at all, but I also have a LinkedIn account that I'm a bit more active. So yeah, you're very welcome to send me a message if you're interested in our paper or anything else. I'm really happy to just discuss and bounce off ideas.
Well, thank you so much for taking the time to come on the show today and share your work.
Thank you so much, Kyle. I'm very excited and happy that you invite me.
Well, that's it for today's episode. Tell you what, do me one of three favors. Either follow us on Twitter @DataSkeptic, sign up for our newsletter at dataskeptic.com, or tell a friend about the show. Any one of those or the triple play would earn you my eternal gratitude. And while you're deciding which route you're going to take, here's a quick preview of next episode.
These models became so good at so many things and so many tasks. This is why we have benchmarks like Big Bench, right? It's hard to create good benchmarks without biases, and it's hard to know when the model really provides the correct answer, or because it knows the answer, or for the right reasons if you want, or if it generates the answer because of some, shortcut or bias or I don't know what.
That's next time on Data Skeptic.